Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to the Apologia Center podcast. My name is Arthur Asadurian, and it is October the 27th, 1 p.m. or 1:01 p.m. here on the West Coast. Welcome. We have an exciting guest. Now, I don't want to take any more of our time because it is limited. I know last week we went for 2.5 hours with our guest. This week we're not going to go for that long. So without taking any more of our time, I want to bring in and welcome our guest for today, Dr. Elizabeth Jackson Withorn. Has that like officially been changed?
Yeah, so I'm kind of using Jackson for more kind of professional
Mm-hmm.
purposes, but then other things or personal things I'll use with Orn. So that's sort
Got
of
it.
how I do that. So I'm happy to use both or whatever you prefer
It was it
is
was
good with
very
me.
interesting
So
because you have some of your stuff is Liz Jackson, and then when you like Google Liz Jackson, there's two dominant Liz Jacksons that pop up.
yeah.
One's you, and another one is another lady. And so I had to actually I was looking through. I was on Amazon, and I was like, okay, she's written a book. I know that, and so because I wanted to put that in the description box, which it's in the description box if anybody
Oh,
wants to
thanks.
buy
Yeah, that's awesome.
Applied Ethics. And so, let me just run through a quick introduction or your CV of sorts. You have a BS in philosophy from Kansas State University, and then a master's and a PhD from the University of Notre Dame in philosophy. Both of them. You are philosophy through and through. That is a
That's right.
unique sort of experience. I know guys that are like Bible college kind of stuff all throughout, but it's just
Yeah.
so. How was
Yeah, I
that?
did
What
philosophy
was
from the
that
beginning.
like?
Oh, yeah, no, it was good. I mean, it's funny, people ask me like, "What made you wanna study philosophy or become a philosophy major?" But I was actually one of those people that changed my major a lot throughout college. So, some people maybe like knew at the very beginning they always wanted to do one thing. That was not me. I like was so what did I do? Political science, math, educate. Like I did all these different majors and I was really torn and I wasn't sure. And then I was like, you know what? I don't really know what philosophy is, but I might just try a philosophy class and just see kind of how I like it or whatever. And it's funny because like literally like just a few weeks into the class, I was like, I have found my jam. I have found my people. This is amazing. Like, and it was actually moral or no, social political philosophy. So
Hmm.
it wasn't even like what I'm specializing in or anything like that, but I just loved it. And then I just ate up all the philosophy that I could. And I actually did think about seminary as a possibility after I finished. I was like, I'm a philosophy major, that's done. But kind of thinking about after that, I thought about seminary, and then I realized seminary is like expensive. You have to pay for it, and then if I can get into like a philosophy PhD program, those are actually funded. So you not only get your tuition covered, but you get like a small stipend. It's nothing crazy. It's usually like $20,000 or something like that.
Yeah.
But I was like, that's kind of interesting. And then I also knew, I just really enjoyed philosophy. And so Notre Dame was actually a great fit because they do a lot of philosophy of religion. And it was, in a way, kind of my dream school. So it was very exciting when I
Oh,
got
that's
when
cool.
I got admitted there. So
So I usually
so
ask
that's kind of
people
how,
to give us a little bit of wisdom as they go through their education because it is a struggle. A lot of people don't realize that being in academics is just hard. Not just
yeah.
in the aspect of studying, reading, and being disciplined, especially when you have to write a dissertation. A lot of people will do their courses and never finish a dissertation because their discipline is extremely important. So, what's some wisdom you can give for some of the viewers that might be considering going into academia and then pursuing a career in that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, there's a lot of things I could say here. And one thing I will say, kind of just on this decision, is I firmly believe you can self teach and learn a lot, even just through YouTube and reading and all of that stuff. On the one hand, but on the other hand, it's not the same as getting formal education in philosophy and really, especially interacting with other grad students that are very, very smart. A lot of people, when they're doing their bachelor's degree, they're sort of, probably the people that go to grad school are often among the top of the class, or at least in the field that they're interested in. And then you come and then everyone's like you, but it's like you can learn so much from these people, these other students, but then also like the professors, and just having them read your work and critique you, or you give a presentation and then, get feedback or have to deal with really hard questions. These kinds of things you're not exposed to in the same way if you're just sort of reading and studying on your own. So I do think, while I know people that know so much about philosophy and haven't had formal education, I think there's a lot of value to formal education. Like in terms of trying to give like advice or something, I mean, there's a lot I could say. I think for me, I learned sort of through my time in grad school, both that at least in philosophy, you often actually do have quite a bit of time in grad school, but you have to be self disciplined and kind of
Mm,
manage it yourself. And I think the biggest thing that helped me was setting kind of parameters around when I would work, and then actually working during that time and not working during other times. So, I wouldn't always work during the full 9 to 5 period, but often choosing, even if it's like 10 to 3 or something, choosing a time within that I'm like, that's when I'm going to get my work done, and then not working on in the evenings and not working on the weekends. I feel like a lot of grad students will like kind of mess around, sleep in, maybe start working mid to late afternoon. So they joke like most people work 9 to 5, grad students work 5 to 9. And then they'll just, they'll work weekends or kind of halfway work weekends, halfway be on social media. And I do all that stuff too. I'm not saying I'm above all that or anything, but it really helped me when I could kind of structure my time and even do time blocking with a calendar where I'll say like,
nice.
for this hour I'm going to work on this paper, for this hour I'm going to read this, for this hour I'm going to, whatever, and just try to get even a few things done each day, even if you're just working for like 2 to 4 hours. Like I don't think you necessarily have to be
Yeah.
working like a full 8 hour day. So that helped me a lot when I could kind of structure my days, and at least have a few big things to get done, even if I wasn't, putting in like an 8 hour day Monday through Friday.
Nice. Nice. Thank you for that. It was when I started my MA in philosophy, I had no philosophy background. I'd taken one class.
Mm,
That was like an introduction to, just philosophy. But then I had classmates that were, had all the background, multiple bachelor's
mm,
degrees and stuff like that. And it was a bit frustrating because they knew all the lingo and stuff like that. And they brought that in. One of the cool things was actually I realized that my interaction with my peers was so beneficial to me,
mm,
in the formal setting of education, right? In especially when you're doing philosophy, and studying philosophy is a bit different because you get to do philosophy in the classroom. If it's done well, you get to do it. I remember one of the first classes I took was an ethics class, and I made some kind of a comment, and then there was a guy in the back of the classroom who was like towards the end of his degree, and he'd already been accepted for a PhD program, who just like straight up called me out, and I was just not used to that. He was like, "Hey, you said that, and can you defend it and this and that?" And I was like, "Whoa, this is seriously.
wow.
We're doing philosophy." He wasn't mean
Yep.
about it, but it
Yeah.
was great because that first experience actually taught me how to process through stuff before I said it,
Mm,
before I spoke up. And it was good because we got to interact with each other and learn from each other and really use community well.
mm.
Now, I was with a bunch of Christians, which also helped quite a bit because for the most part, everyone was very nice.
Oh,
the,
good,
the, the
good. Yeah.
competition wasn't really there. Nobody was trying to kind of get ahead of each other. Everybody was working together. So that was really encouraging. So cool. You
Yeah.
deal with my favorite branch of philosophy. Now, when I
Ah.
started my education in philosophy, I thought I was going to love metaphysics the most, ethics second, and epistemology last. And what ended up happening is that I love epistemology the most, and then metaphysics, and then ethics. Now you've written a
Nice.
book on applied ethics, so not gonna go there. But you deal with epistemology, and so we have
Yeah.
to deal with rationality and how to think. Um, I always say about 70% of doing philosophy is definitions and having proper definitions. So let's start there. How would we define rationality? We use this term quite a bit, but how would you define it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. First of all, I want to say I love that epistemology is now your favorite. That's awesome. I am also biased towards epistemology, but I think that's cool. But yeah, in terms of rationality, I think this is actually a really great place to start. And actually, it's not a question I get as much as you would think. So I'm really glad you brought it up. So I will say one thing that's really important to note is that most epistemologists and most philosophers think that there are different kinds of rationality. So there's not just rationality period, but there's different types of rationality. And since we're talking about epistemology here, I think the kind of rationality that we're probably interested in is what's known as epistemic rationality. And so, what is epistemic rationality? Well, it's usually known as rationality that's concerned with getting at the truth and avoiding error. So, when we're thinking about the goals of believing, having true beliefs and avoiding false beliefs, that's kind of what epistemic rationality is concerned with. And there's tons of debates here, like what's the best way to do that? Is it always to follow your evidence? We'll talk more about some of these kind of questions that come up with respect to that. But some examples of epistemically rational beliefs I think could be helpful. So, a common one is a belief being based on good evidence. A belief's being formed as a result of a reliable process. So, a reliable process would be like, looking at a large size object in good daylight. A not reliable process would be like looking at a faraway object that's moving very quickly at night or something.
Correct.
And in the former, you can much more clearly perceive what the object is than in the latter. So those are kind of examples of beliefs that would be epistemically rational. Ones that wouldn't be would be like beliefs that are based on wishful thinking. So believing something just because you want it to be true and for no other reason, or beliefs based on, like emotional attachment, or beliefs that totally go against, what the evidence seems to support, that kind of
So
thing.
some
Um,
far-fetched conspiracy theories would fall into line.
yeah,
Side
yeah.
question, I guess. Why do people get so attached to their theories of that sort? Like when you can be clear-minded and look at something and say there's seriously no evidence for this.
Mm,
But the individual that you're speaking with is so committed to whatever it is that they're committed to. I mean, you mentioned emotions as being one of them. What could be some possible reasons? Because the reason I ask is plenty of atheists, as a matter of fact, accuse theists or Christians of having this sort of a belief.
yeah, totally. No, definitely. I mean, I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff here, and like the whole question of actually conspiracy theories in general. That's actually one that epistemologists have been really interested in. But yeah, I think why people get into conspiracy theories, sort of what causes all of that. I'm sure there's a lot of different things
Mm-hmm.
that cause that, but I do think a lot of it is like the people around you, who you choose to talk to, whether you interact with people that disagree with you or just only stay within what's known as, sometimes they call it an echo chamber, which is
Mm-hmm.
people just repeating the same views over and over again, and you never really talk to people that disagree with you. And one thing I actually encourage people in general, I mean, a lot of conspiracy theories are maybe more about politics or something else, but in other fields as well, like ethics and religion and any of these really controversial topics, is make sure you're interacting with some people that disagree with you. Make
Mm.
sure you're not only following on Twitter, those that have the same perspective or the same viewpoint as you. And I really encourage this with my students as well. Like, you shouldn't assume that, even if you think you're right, and you probably do because that's your view, you can't just say like we're the only group that's rational and there's nothing else I could ever learn from the
Mm.
other group, or they're just all irrational automatically. I mean, sure, I'm sure, like, yeah, people are irrational. It's not like I'm saying everyone's rational, but I think a lot of times it's like, you can take abortion, for example. It's like easy to say the people with my view, whether that's pro-life or pro-choice, are rational and sensitive to the evidence, and the people with the other view, they're all irrational and just ignoring evidence or whatever. And like, I'm like, actually, no, I think in a lot of cases both views could be rational. That doesn't mean they're both right. One's right and one's wrong, but
Okay.
they could both be rational. So I
So
think
okay.
that's really important.
So that's interesting
Yeah.
because you distinguish between rational and the correctness of the view or the rightness of the view. In
Hmm.
that, are we defining being rational there as something that can have some evidence for it, is logically consistent? The conclusion follows the premises or something like that.
Yeah, good. I mean, actually, so now this is kind of coming back to our original question. So yeah, I think one way, like, you can think about rationality as like people could set different bars for rationality. And some people might set a really high bar and make it really, really hard to be rational. And other people might set a really low bar so that like
Mm-hmm.
everyone is always rational. And I think we should probably set it kind of somewhere in the middle. But I do think, and so there are going to be people like maybe, I don't know, not to call anyone out, like flat earthers, like maybe most of them are not rational, right? So, but there's this interesting question, like if these two people can disagree, does that sever kind of this thing that I've been talking about earlier, which is that epistemic rationality is supposed to
Mm-hmm.
help us get to the truth? And I think the answer there is that, well, it does help us get to the truth, but sometimes the evidence is really complicated and difficult to assess. And I think sometimes there's multiple equally good ways to interpret the evidence and ways to understand the evidence. And so part of this is just sort of a reminder of our fallibility. I definitely think two people can disagree and both be rational. And I think that's just because the evidence can be complicated. And even if you're following the evidence really, really well, you might not always come to the same conclusion as someone else. And I think a lot of these controversial issues and the fact that there's really smart people on both sides defending these, the fact that for some of these philosophers have been arguing about them for like decades, if not millennia, I think does show that two disagreeing sides can both be epistemically
Okay.
rational.
Okay. So how does epistemology? I mean, you touched on it, but how does epistemology, or how can it help us in this endeavor?
Yeah, it's good. So I think epistemology can really kind of help us clarify our concepts, and we've actually already been doing some epistemology already. But basically, what epistemology is, I usually define it as the study of really two things: the study of knowledge and also rational or justified belief. They're very related things, but I think both of these components are important. So some of the big questions we would look at when we're doing epistemology is, so what is knowledge? That's maybe like in some ways the most fundamental question. And a lot of people think knowledge is actually justified true belief and then maybe plus some other stuff. So things get a little bit complicated here, but note that having justified belief is actually part of knowing. So if you have a belief that's true but it's based on wishful thinking or something, a lot of people would think that would actually prohibit you from knowing. So you need your belief to be rational or justified in order to know. And so that's kind of where the second question, or this question of what is rational or justified belief, sort of ties in here. Is that part of knowledge is having a rational or a justified belief. And I think, even when we're just thinking about the question, like, what should I believe or what should I not believe, sort of having a theory of rationality and having an understanding of what it means for a belief to be rational can, I think, really, really help us with that question.
Mm.
So maybe I'll just briefly say, on this question, what makes a belief rational or justified, there are really two main views. And they're known as internalists and then externalists. So internalists think that what's rational or justified for you is a matter of something that you can kind of internally access, and often it's a matter of sort of following your evidence is the most common internalist view. It's sometimes known as evidentialism.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's externalists. So externalists have the view that a rational or justified belief is actually a matter of something that's external to you. So it might be a matter of whether the process that you used is reliable or whether your mind is functioning properly. And actually, Alvin Plantinga, who's a very famous Christian philosopher and epistemologist, was a pretty well-known externalist who argued that we actually have this part of our minds that he called the sensus divinitatis, or the sense of the divine. And that was kind of responsible for helping us reliably form beliefs about God. On the other hand, though, I think you could be very well be an evidentialist and say, yeah, but look, there is good evidence for theism or for Christianity. And one thing that I think a lot of people miss that aren't maybe immersed in epistemology is that evidence isn't just like a philosophical argument, or some people might think like it's like, oh, it has to be this physical like thing in the world, like it's like a fingerprint on a gun or something. But evidence is actually this very abundant thing. So your memories are evidence, your perceptions are evidence. Even when things seem true to you, that can be evidence. And so even if you think evidence is required for theistic belief to be rational, I think, given how abundant evidence is, there's a pretty good story about how, for at least a lot of theists, theistic belief could be rational. So
Cool. So just you touched on internalism and externalism.
mhm.
Do we have Christians that are internalists as well as externalists.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I don't think there's sort of a settled view among Christians about which view is correct. And actually, I think this is actually a strength, which is that I think you can actually show that Christian belief could be rational on either view. On the view where you have to have access to what's justifying you, or on the view where that's something external to you. So yeah, I don't think there's one view that Christians have to
Yeah,
take,
we
but
just
I
want to
think
throw that
both
out
views
there.
support Christianity. Yeah. So it's not like the Bible is like, James 3:57, and the nature of epistemic justification is internal. Like, no, that's
Correct.
not.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. This
yeah.
kind of, you can look at this in the sense of maybe even metaphysics, where you get Christians who are Platonists, and you get Christians
Mhm.
who aren't. It's not it's an interpretation, you can say, of the facts that are out there, and doing our best to come to these conclusions. So we're talking about whether it is rational for one to hold religious claims or religious beliefs. Now, you use this word belief, right? You said that one believes something, and that gets used in a number of ways in our culture. Sometimes the word belief is just used as wishful thinking, like you were saying. And then sometimes it is not. I mean, the way you define knowledge, right, justify true belief, is not just wishful thinking. I mean, the idea there is that you have evidence for it, and so it's important. So here's a claim: I believe in God.
Mhm.
Right? That's you can say a simple statement, but a complex idea.
Mm.
Now, is this a knowledge claim? When somebody says, I believe in God, or I don't believe in God, do we consider that a knowledge claim?
Yeah, I would say no. I think knowledge and belief are different.
Hmm.
So, what is belief? Well, belief is saying, I take this thing to be the case. I represent the world to be this way. We could take a more mundane example, like I believe it's raining. What I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying is, in my picture of the world, it's raining. That's how I represent the world, right? But it's not. I think people can actually make beliefs, the word belief, like more charged than they need to be. But I don't think when we're making claims about belief, we're not automatically making claims about what's rational or irrational. We're not, automatically making claims. I mean, when I say I believe that something's true, I guess I'm making a claim about what's true. But when I say someone else believes something, we can believe things that are false. So belief and truth come apart. So the way one way to think about it is, here's all the things we believe, this big circle. And then within that, those that are justified, those that are true, and then maybe those that meet some other conditions that get complicated here. Those are the things we know. So belief is much broader. Beliefs can be rational, beliefs can be irrational, beliefs can be true, beliefs can be false. And then within that circle, there's the circle of things we know, and those are the things that are justified and true, and maybe meet some other conditions also. So
Okay,
knowledge is more restricted than belief.
got it. So
Yeah.
are there any religious claims that cannot be rationally supported?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. And so I think what my view is, like, by religious claim, I think you mean like a religious statement, or something that someone
Correct.
might
Yeah.
believe that's of religious nature. Um, I think what we actually should avoid doing is treating all religious claims or religious beliefs in the exact same way. I
Hmm.
actually don't think we should treat them all the same. So I think in general, beliefs can be rational and beliefs can be irrational. You might bring up faith. That's another thing I'm interested in and have thought about some. I think faith can be rational and faith can be irrational.
Correct.
And I think even specifically religious beliefs, some can be rational and some can be irrational. And so, I think to say religious belief is always rational no matter what the religion, no matter what the person's evidence is, no matter what the person's been exposed to, I just think no, that's going too far in one direction. But then to go on the other hand and say religious belief is never rational, and no religious person could ever have a rational belief in God, or a belief that Christianity is true, or a belief that their religion is true, that's also going too far. And so I think that the correct position is in the middle. I think religious belief and religious faith is often rational, but to say it always is, no matter what the circumstance or no matter what the belief, I think that can't be right. um,
Okay.
yeah.
So would you say Christians ought to have, or at least at the very least strive to have, beliefs that are rational.
Yeah, absolutely. No, definitely. And I think I will say too, like, I don't want the view that I have in epistemology to have the consequence that most Christians are irrational, or that most Christians even have to be able to like spout out arguments for God's existence in order to rationally believe in God. I just don't think that's the case.
Hmm.
There's this whole tradition, also going back to kind of Plantinga, called Reformed epistemology. And it's actually this pretty basic claim, although it gets wrapped up in all these more complicated debates. But it's just this claim that it can be rational to believe in God even without being able to give like a sophisticated philosophical argument for God's existence. And I think that's very reasonable, and I think that's
Seems to be
definitely
the
true.
case.
So when you look at kind of like all the religious people or all of the Christians, I want to say like a lot of them are rational, especially in, you know, their basic beliefs about God, Jesus, the Bible, like that kind of thing. When we get into more nitty-gritty theological debates, things might get more complicated here. But I think when we kind of just say like they're you know their basic beliefs about God and Christianity, I think for most of those would be rational, and they don't need to be able to spout out these complicated philosophical arguments. You know, think about your sweet grandma who's gone to church her whole life and every night kneels down and says a prayer for you. Like, do we want to say she's irrational because she doesn't know about the cosmological argument? Like, that's just sad.
Right.
So yeah, I think this comes back to what we were talking about before. Where do we set that bar for rationality? And I think this is one reason why we don't want to set it too high. You don't have to be able to give an argument for every belief that you have in order for that belief to be rational. That would just be too high of a bar.
Correct. Very well
Yeah.
put. Thank you.
Hmm.
Now you've done some work on, and I got to be honest, I haven't done reading. I know you've done this work, and I'm very interested in it because I tend to be
Oh, cool.
one of the more skeptical ones when it comes to this specific argument. But I saw it. I was like, oh man, this is very interesting. So there's something that is in philosophy and in theological circles. And anybody that's taken a philosophy 101 class, I'm very sure has been exposed to this, regardless of the setting. There's sort of an argument called Pascal's wager.
Mm.
So first and foremost, tell us what Pascal's wager is, and then we'll talk about how you're sort of reformulating that and maybe taking it in a certain, maybe better direction. So what is
Yeah.
Pascal's wager? I mean, where did it come from? What's the idea behind it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I like to often explain it, it sort of will contrast it with other arguments that are also theistic arguments, and some of your listeners are probably familiar. So, you know, the fine-tuning argument or the cosmological argument or the ontological argument, these arguments are they're giving evidence that God exists, and their conclusion is just simply that God exists, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one big misconception, and I think is really important to note, that is actually not the conclusion that Pascal's wager gives. And Pascal's wager actually isn't even about giving evidence that God exists. So Pascal's wager, the conclusion of Pascal's wager is, you know, there's different ways of putting this exactly, but it's something like you should believe in God or you should commit to God. And so it's not giving evidence that God exists, but what it's saying is that given sort of maybe actually some of these things about rationality we've been talking about, although this is more about practical rationality
Correct.
than epistemic rationality. But given that, sort of the best thing to do looking at the cost benefit analysis is to believe in God or commit to God. And you know, also maybe explain the sort of most basic reasoning behind this, but then note that like a lot of philosophers and actually even arguably Pascal himself, this wasn't the exact reasoning they give. It's like more complicated or tweaked in various ways. But here's the most basic sort of version of the wager, and it says, okay, look, either God exists or God doesn't exist. And either you believe in or commit to God, or you don't believe in or commit to God. And like, let's just think about sort of what the outcome would be on each of those. You can kind of have like a 4x4 matrix. So if you believe in God or commit to God and God exists, things look very good for you. Whether that's going to heaven or even just the good of having a relationship with this all good, all loving, creative, powerful being. I mean, that's pretty cool. So committing or believing in God, and God exists, things look really good, maybe even infinitely good. Okay. If God exists and you don't commit to God, you know, theists and Christians and philosophers debate about exactly what happens there, but you miss out on the good of a relationship with God. Some people, you could arguably say some people would say you could go to hell, or maybe you cease to exist at death. But at the very least, you're missing out on something big, and it's less good than if God exists and you commit to or believe in God. Okay, so that's kind of what the possibilities if God exists. If God doesn't exist, what do we say about that? Well, whether you believe in God or not, it's very unlikely there's any kind of afterlife. And it seems like, you could say, well, if you don't believe in God and God doesn't exist, there's another true belief you have. So, we can kind of weigh these different costs and benefits. But then some people say, well, there's still a lot of benefits of being religious, even if God doesn't exist. You get this great community, and religious people are happier and healthier and less likely to get divorced. So there's a lot of things we can weigh here. But those are going to sort of pale in comparison to the goodness of having a relationship with God, having this commitment to God if God exists, which some people argue is actually even infinitely good.
Hmm.
And so the idea is like, look at this cost benefit. Sort of the best way to kind of hedge your bets or sort of proceed in light of these values is, unless you have literally, your confidence that God exists is literally zero. You're saying it's impossible for God to exist. If you think there's any possibility that God exists, then you should wager on God by either believing in God or making a commitment to God or something like that. So I will say, and we can go into some of these if you want. There's a lot of objections to this. It's not like this super straightforward thing that's just going to convince everyone. But I do think this is why it's important to realize that most philosophers, and even Pascal himself, want to make it more complicated than this, and think this needs some tweaking or some, to kind of consider some more factors when we're making this argument. So I will say most versions defended today, and even the version given by Pascal himself, aren't exactly this version. I just like to give this version so you can kind of get the basic thing out on the table, and then we can talk about objections and then ways you might kind of tweak the wager or make it more complicated.
Correct. Because it seems like the wager only works, that version of it at least, when you're dealing with an atheist or a non-theist and a theist, generally speaking. It gets a bit more complicated when you're, say, dealing with a Christian and a Muslim.
Yes,
Because
absolutely.
because it no longer becomes about no belief and then nothing happening and then practically happening,
Yep.
but you could be in the wrong camp, and so this naturally complicates the matter. So
Yeah.
what's the work you've done in this area? How have you kind of tweaked it and changed it?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just say, first of all, when you read the Pensée, when you read Pascal himself, Pascal actually deals with this kind of worry. And the way Pascal does it is people really hone in and focus on the wager and then ignore like all the stuff that was written before that. But Pascal actually gives arguments for Christianity. And what Pascal, I think, takes himself to be doing is saying, look, Christianity is way more likely, way more probable than all these other religions. So once you kind of establish that, he thought, look, okay, now that I've sort of established Christianity is the most likely religion to be true, well, why should I pick Christianity or should I pick atheism? And then the wager kind of comes in. And so I think Pascal thinks he's actually kind of dealt with this objection previously, but not through this pragmatic argument, through these epistemic, more traditional arguments where you're giving evidence for Christianity. So I think that's sort of the way Pascal deals with it. The way that I've dealt with it in some of my work, I mean, I think there's different ways you can respond to this, but maybe a way that contrasts with the way that Pascal did it is I actually don't make the wager Christianity specific. And it can be, but I think you got to do what Pascal does and give arguments for Christianity to make that work. And I'm more focused on the pragmatic stuff. And so what I say is, well, look, yeah, there's Christians, there's Muslims, there's all these different views. Let's incorporate all of these different religions into the wager itself. So, given this way of doing it, if you're not relying on arguments for Christianity, you're actually not going to get as strong of a conclusion. You're not going to get this conclusion that, Christianity just wins every time, no matter what, no matter how confident you are in it. But the main conclusion that my version of the wager says is that you should commit to, believe in, or just wager on the religion that you think is most likely to be true. And you might think, well, that's boring because you already think it's most likely to be true. Well, no, it's actually still very interesting because it means that living your life as an atheist or even as an agnostic isn't rational. You need to look at these religions that are making these claims about infinities and about what could or couldn't happen in the afterlife, kind of weigh those against each other, and then go for the one that you think is most likely to be true. And so I think that's actually a pretty strong result. And then,
Mm.
like I mentioned, you could take that and then combine it with an argument that says, Christianity is most likely to be true, or you can even insert other religions there too. And if you give those arguments for Christianity, then you can get kind of a Christian wager going. So that's my version of the wager, which is you could see as step one of an argument for Christianity, or you could just see as kind of a general argument that you should be religious and take religion very seriously.
It's like a backdoor entrance.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, but I kind of like it. I mean, I kind of think it's kind of creative and fun. It's like a little different than some of the more maybe traditional ways of getting in. And I'll say one more thing too. When you look at like traditional arguments that just conclude like God exists or something, that's still obviously a very significant conclusion, very controversial. But the wager is in a way actually even more significant. And part of me wonders if this is why people get so upset when they hear about Pascal's wager sometimes.
Mm.
Not mostly non-believers, but it's telling you that you should do something. It's not just saying God exists, it's saying you should commit to God. You should commit your life to God. You should do everything you can to believe in God. You should do the, and in a way, it's like even, in a way, it's even stronger because if God exists, then we kind of go from there to say, okay, what should I do? And you have to kind of think about that and argue from that. The wager itself is telling you that you got to do something, and in a way, it's like this actually very very strong conclusion, even though if in some ways it feels weaker. So I think that's interesting too.
Yeah, there's a practical, pragmatic aspect of it that's really cool because, especially as Christians and especially as people who deal in apologetics, we don't think that God's like really concerned about your agreement on his existence or disagreement on his existence. What God wants is for us to give our lives to him and follow after him in
Yeah.
Jesus. And so that's partly why the wager has the weight that it does. Cool. So you got this back way entrance. It's very interesting to me because practically I've dealt with quite a bit of people, Iranians specifically, who have had this experience with Islam. And also friends who've dealt with Turks in this, they say the same exact thing. This kind of version of Islam that they've experienced and then left it and become atheists, where they would have previously never converted to Christianity from Islam. They become atheists and then gone from atheism to Christianity.
Very interesting. Yeah.
And I suppose that might be because there's certain things that they are closed off to epistemically when they are Muslims, that when they become atheists, given a certain time span, they become more open to that. Do you have any comments on that, on how we can break that down and understand it? Maybe that would be a route for people to go through or something similar of that sort. And then, because I see it tied in with like some of these conversations that happen with like deconverting and stuff like that, deconstructing.
Yeah, I think this is interesting. I mean, I think there's kind of different ways of viewing kind of what's going on in some of these cases. So, one way of viewing it is like, uh, Christianity and Islam, it's almost like being married to two different people or something. So,
That's, yeah.
you're married to one person, and then it's a lot harder for you, even psychologically. I mean, you can talk about the ethics of divorce. That's not really the point here. It's just that I think it could be harder psychologically to just jump into a marriage with someone else, whereas if you are married to someone and then for whatever reason, they pass away or you're not married anymore, you get divorced, and then you're kind of single for a while, you might kind of find yourself in a situation where it's psychologically much easier than to go and marry someone else rather than just jumping from one marriage to another. I don't know if that's like a good diagnosis of what's going on or not. There's even questions about whether that's like the best way of viewing these various religions. But at least in terms of maybe a possible kind of like psychological explanation of why they go through atheism first. At least for some people, that might be part of the explanation. I'm not 100% sure. I don't know. What do you think?
So how much? Well, I've come to a very similar conclusion because we when we think about rationality and we think about epistemology and reasons and evidences, it is not very often where we think about kind of our emotions and the psychology behind dealing with these things and difficulties we go through. And that's not necessarily always a negative thing. It could be a negative thing, but I would say it's a.
Hmm.
And oftentimes it's a great thing. So,
Yeah.
in what ways are psychology and rationality, or even the kind of epistemology as a discipline, are they connected? Because we're not just machines. I mean, very clearly, we're not machines, right? I mean, machines get their thinking patterns from us, I would say, but.
Yeah.
There's things that happen with us when we're dealing with an evidence, an argument that a machine doesn't go through.
Totally. I think there's a lot of really interesting connections between epistemology and psychology. And I'm actually really personally interested in psychology. I haven't done as much formal work on it, but actually, kind of this is like funny timing because I just got a grant with another philosopher named Mike Rhoda. When what we're going to be doing is we're going to be personally learning more psychology. And then also, we have some money to train other people in psychology as well. And so we haven't done it yet. So don't ask me yet what all our conclusions are, what we're going to do. But it's actually really related to a lot of the stuff we're talking about in this interview, where religious belief, religious commitment, what makes those rational, and then like looking at those from a psychological perspective. So I'm really, really interested in that. And I think one thing just that I think is really relevant is just looking at belief itself. There's so many different questions about what it means to believe, what the nature of belief is, rational and irrational beliefs. And I actually think some of these epistemologists could be actually paying more attention to psychologists. So exactly what you said, like we don't just, oh, there's a water bottle. Ah, I believe there's a water bottle. Walk through my day. Like that, like that's a very like simple, easy case of just
Yeah.
perceiving something and believing it. But a lot of cases, our beliefs are a lot more complicated than that. Like you might be, in denial about whether your wife is cheating on you. You might be emotionally attached to the idea of getting a degree you're not cut out for. You might be deluded about something. You might be, ignoring all the evidence except for the evidence that the people in your immediate community are giving you. So there's all these different factors and emotions and social factors and things that we were brought up with but just are kind of holding on to even though we don't have good evidence for them that affect our beliefs. And it's not just this simple like I perceive this cup or I see that it's self-evident that 1 + 1 = 2. Like, no, beliefs are way more complicated than that. And I think sometimes epistemologists fail to appreciate this and actually even will define belief in a way that makes it too rational. And it's like,
Huh.
can't we believe irrationally sometimes? Like, aren't like it's almost like what you were saying about us being robots. Like, we're not just these belief forming robots that are just like cup table belief. Like it's a lot more complicated than that. And I don't think this is a bad thing either. Like I think in some ways this is what makes us interesting people. And I think we should strive to be rational in our believing, but I also think there's a lot of space, and it's really important to note that we shouldn't just define belief in a way that means that we couldn't be irrational in believing. And also note that a lot of things affect our beliefs, not just these like pure and unadulterated pieces of evidence that enter our mind and then aren't filtered in any way or anything like that. So
Yeah.
yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yeah, I tend to think people who are emotionless towards the evidence are pretty irrational, as a matter of fact, because I think it's rational to have
Yeah,
certain
I like
emotional
that.
reactions towards certain things.
Totally.
That makes complete sense. I mean, if you find that salvation is in Jesus and you believe that and you have all the evidence for that, your emotional reaction ought to be a positive one, right? Like it
Yeah,
shouldn't
yeah,
just be
yeah.
like, I'm not feeling anything. Like, so
Totally. I
we
think
shouldn't give that up.
yeah. I think there's this misconception that like emotions are just this totally truth irrelevant thing, and like emotions never help us find the truth and just aren't, it's like, are you going to be logical or are you going to be emotional? And I totally agree. I just don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think we have emotions for a reason and they're a very good thing. And actually I think studying too much philosophy in a way that is pushing emotions away can be really bad. Like your example is great. I mean, another thing is like philosophers will just give these like awful, horrible like thought experiments. Like you're in a trolley and you're about to go like run over five people, and they're just like, should you put? And it's like, shouldn't we kind of like think about like how awful this is? Like this is a pretty messed up situation, and we need to like appreciate like people's emotional responses to that, not just like this like cold calculating. I mean, I don't know. So it's not like emotions should rule everything and like emotions are all that matters. No, but I think like we have emotions for a reason and we shouldn't like throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think emotions can be very valuable and helpful to point us towards the truth.
Okay, great. You've written on these. You've written plenty of articles. Right.
Yeah, I haven't written as much about emotions specifically, but I find them so fascinating. I would love
Okay.
to do more work on them in the future. But I
No,
have written a lot
I
of
was
things
generally
and other things.
asking about epistemology
Yeah,
and stuff
yeah,
because
yeah.
I would like to put, if they're publicly accessible, to put some of those links in the
Sure.
description box for folks to kind of interact. You also have a YouTube channel.
I do. I do.
It's really cool when you get professional philosophers who are also engaging people in the social media world, because
Yeah.
you tend to have these really, really smart folks that are just like not savvy with technology and
Oh,
stuff. And then
yeah,
all
yeah,
they're doing is
yeah.
writing books. So again, that's in the description box. If you want to check out Liz's channel, please go and subscribe and interact. She's got really, really cool stuff on her channel. So again, that's
Oh,
pasted there.
thanks.
There's a question that's come in, and I'll qualify. It says, it says, do both of you agree with the Google definition of Christianity? Should we as believers seek
Ooh.
to change it? Now, I asked what the Google definition of Christianity is, and it says, the religion based on the person and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, or its beliefs and practices.
It's not too bad. I don't know. What do you think? I
It
mean, it could
seems,
be more
yeah.
descriptive for sure, but I like that it's centered on Jesus.
Yeah,
Um,
it's just general,
yeah,
because I would say
yeah,
in my immediate my theology kind of, my heretic hunter cap
yeah,
comes
yeah,
into
yeah.
play here, and I'm like, well,
Good.
that's gonna like include Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and all sorts
Oh,
of
good.
cults,
Yeah, yeah,
because
yeah.
they're gonna claim to be followers of Jesus, and I would like it to be a bit more qualified,
Hmm.
because I even distinguish between what it means to be saved and what it means to be a Christian. So
Mm,
for
yeah.
me, being a Christian means that you hold certain um, very primary foundational beliefs of what we would consider Christianity in general. Like the Trinity would be an essential part of
Mhm.
someone being a Christian. So if anybody denies the Trinity, I no longer consider them to be Christians. Now that's denying it knowingly, right? Like there's plenty of people that, again, this is the epistemology stuff coming there. There's
Yeah,
plenty of
yeah.
people in our churches, if we were to ask them to articulate the Trinity, then they would have a hard time articulating the Trinity.
Totally.
Either they can't articulate themselves well, or they don't know it as well, but they might believe it,
Yeah.
right? And maybe you have a couple of comments on that, like someone believing there is a Trinity but can't articulate it themselves.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think this kind of thing happens all the time. And this actually, again, I keep coming back to this, but like the bar what we're setting for people, and maybe we were talking about the bar for rationality, but there also might be a bar for like understanding or having a concept or kind of knowing something on a general level or something. And like, let's say you go up to a kid and you're like, where's your dad? And he's like, that's my dad's like little kid, and you're like, well, how do you know that's your dad? Give me an argument for it. Like, prove it to me, and it's like, okay, yeah, the kid isn't really going to have much to say to you. He's just going to be like, no, I just know that's my dad. But he knows it's his dad. Like, I don't think we should deny the child knowledge simply because he can't be like, premise one, if, what, whatever, the definition of father is XYZ. This
Yeah.
person meets that definition. So yeah, I think, but I think too, like, we have the concept, another example is we have the concept of knowledge, even though knowledge is really difficult for a lot of people to define. And actually, knowledge is really difficult for those who study epistemology professionally to define. But we use the word all the time. We have the concept. We have a good sense of these are cases where people know and these are cases where people don't know. And so I think, either saying someone, knows or believes or has a concept of the Trinity, those kinds of things, like they don't have to be able to give arguments for it, and they might not even be able to give you like a good definition or articulation of it. At the same time, I think they can absolutely count as having a concept of or believing that God is a Trinity. So those are just maybe some examples to, I think, kind of support what you're saying.
Okay, so when we do apologetics, okay, well, we got about 10 minutes left. So let's talk, because apologetics generally deals with actually giving arguments for God's existence.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're dealing with apologetics, how much of this do we really want to push, this kind of rational aspect of it? Because then you get a pushback from a lot of people saying, well, look, I had this experience, I have friends who were drug addicts and who just didn't know anything else to do with their life. And they prayed and said, God, if you're real, help me. I need to overcome this. And then they were no longer addicted to the drug that they were addicted to, like literally through a prayer. And they're like, well, God exists.
Yeah. Totally.
They don't want to give any arguments. They're like, here's what happened in my life. Like, how rational, the way we're speaking about this, and could we consider that this individual is someone who legitimately has beliefs properly in the way that you're supposed to have them, without us going after them and saying, come on, add some more stuff to that?
Yeah. I mean, so this kind of example is exactly why epistemology is so important, right? If we're not thinking about epistemology and all we're thinking about is what are the arguments for and against God's existence, and we're not asking questions about, well, what does it mean to rationally believe in God? What does it mean to know that God exists? What role exactly are these arguments playing in those questions? Then I think it's hard for us to distinguish between the person who's studied these arguments their whole life, and then the person who comes to believe in God because they had some religious experience, or they were cured from some addiction or some illness, or whatever it is. And so my view, and I kind of mentioned this already, is like, you don't need those arguments, aren't strictly necessary at all to be rational to believe in God. And I don't even know that you need those arguments to know that God exists. That said, there is still value to having those arguments in your back pocket. And I think for two reasons. I mean, one, I think you might be in a place where rationally believe that God exists, but you might still have some doubts about it. You might still have questions. And I think having these arguments can help sort of strengthen the faith of people and kind of show like there is evidence for this. There's good evidence for this. There's good philosophical evidence in particular for this. So I think that's one reason. But I also think another reason is that when you're talking to people that aren't theists or aren't Christians and have a bunch of questions or want to know, like, why should I believe in God? I mean, I actually think telling your personal story and saying, here's kind of what God did in my life is a great response to that. But I think some people have questions that are a little more intellectual. They kind of want to know, what are some maybe concrete or maybe more like quote unquote objective pieces of evidence? Like, stories are great, and I think that's super good. I don't think we should abandon that. But I think there's a value to kind of having these like intellectual concerns being met. And whether that's, on the one hand, giving positive arguments for Christianity, or on the other hand, giving responses to objections that people might have, like, why does God allow so much evil in the world? Or why does God seem hidden or something? So even if to know that God exists or to rationally believe that God exists, we don't need these arguments, I think they still have a role to play, both in helping Christians with doubts and also helping people that have like intellectual questions or doubts about theism or about Christianity.
Okay, so personal testimonies are an excellent way of going about, according to you, they'd be a great way of going about this.
Yeah, they are. I'm just saying that's, they have a role to play and they're very important, but also the arguments have a role to play too. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. It absolutely does, because it also goes from like what you believe yourself, the amount of evidence one might need, and what evidence someone else might need. Because the person has changed, then we have different criteria, you could say, of what's working. So your testimony might be
Totally.
great enough for someone who's known you their entire life and has seen your life change. And that might be good enough for them to come to know Jesus because they have evidence of your life changing, as opposed to someone who
Yeah.
doesn't know you, might not even really trust that your life has changed very much. And then they might
Yeah.
need some external evidence for that.
And related to this too, I think one thing that I've heard some Christians say that I just don't agree with is that people never have purely intellectual questions or doubts,
Hmm.
or people never have purely intellectual barriers to Christianity. And I just think that's not true. I mean, it might be that a lot of barriers are emotional, and a lot of even barriers that seem intellectual at first end up being rooted in emotions. But I think to say that arguments never have a role to play because people don't have intellectual barriers to, I just think that's not true. I've known too many people, and I think myself, I've encountered even my own intellectual barriers and doubts where learning philosophy and reading arguments for God's existence or reading about religious epistemology has really helped. Even reading and studying Pascal's Wager has helped me a lot. And so I think it's overly simplistic to say that's never a barrier for someone, or that's never a cause of someone's doubts, and they're really doubting only because they're sinning. Like, sure, of course people doubt all the time because of sin. I'm not saying that never happens, but I do think people have genuine questions, and it's really good to be able to answer those, coming from an intellectual point of view as well.
Oh, cool. We're coming towards the end again here, and somebody's asked a question.
Yeah.
If you don't want to answer this, don't. We might have you back on just to answer this question because I know it's complicated.
Yeah.
But someone asked, did she have a solution to the Gettier problem?
Ooh. Yeah, no, this is tough. I feel like I feel like you're right. I could talk about this for like an hour. Well, maybe I will say I do have a couple of videos on my YouTube channel, which I know you've linked in the description, talking about what is the Gettier problem and explaining it in more detail. Basically, the problem is this. It seems like there are cases of justified true belief. So the person justified true belief, but they don't know the thing in question. So I'll give you one quick example. Let's say you walk into your office, and every day you've walked into this office and your clock has always been working, and you walk into the office, you see it says 9 o'clock, and you form the belief it's 9 o'clock, and it happens to be 9 o'clock. So the belief is true. And because your clock has been working for all the years that you've worked there, the belief is justified. So you have a justified true belief. But let's say there's a twist and the clock actually is stopped. So the clock is not working. But the other twist is that it actually stopped last night at 9 p.m. But it's one of those clocks that doesn't tell you AM or PM. It just has the hands. And so, you kind of got unlucky that it stopped, but then you got lucky that you walked in at the exact time that it stopped at. And so it's a justified true belief, but a lot of people think you don't know. And part of the reason you don't know is because there's these two different kind of strokes of luck that are involved. Yeah, so then there's this huge puzzle, which is, okay, if knowledge isn't justified true belief, how do we sort of fill that gap? How do we go from justified true belief? What's that missing piece to get to knowledge? And yeah, I don't actually have personally like one preferred solution to that. I actually think adding some kind of general anti-luck condition is actually not totally implausible when saying it's justified true belief that doesn't result in luck or something. I think one objection to that is, well, what does it mean for it to be lucky? And, how do we sort of spell that out in more detail? And you might think that just kind of pushes the problem back a little bit. But I actually think that's not justified true belief that doesn't have luck involved, or, something like that isn't a terrible definition of knowledge. But when you look at the literature on this, it's been going on for a very long time, and there's a lot of people giving new definitions, and then people saying that one won't work for this reason. And actually, this is part of why I think some people have moved from trying to define knowledge to actually just working on other questions like, what is rational belief? What should we believe? And a lot of my work is actually more focused on rational belief than sort of these questions about the exact nature of knowledge. So I know that's probably not totally satisfying. I'm not even totally convinced Gettier problems do have a solution. And there's actually people, I'll say too, very quickly, that actually think we shouldn't define knowledge at all, but we should treat knowledge as basic. So that would be called the knowledge first view. And this is like Timothy Williamson's view. So there's a couple different ways you could go here. So yeah, I guess the answer is I don't really have have a solution, but I think it's an interesting problem, and maybe some kind of anti-luck condition could help.
Could we say that there's some kind of a fourth condition in there that we can't really put our finger on it, but there is a fourth condition?
Yeah, and actually some people just say knowledge is justified true ungettered belief. And they just say ungettered is whatever that fourth condition is.
I
And
love
then
it. I love how philosophers just think they can make stuff up.
yeah. Well, it's
It's
kind of
great.
like how it's kind of like how mathematicians, it's like the square root of the -1 is undefined, so they just call it I, and then they do it's kind of like that sort of move a little bit, but
Because
anyway,
philosophers
yeah.
love making words up, and yeah,
Yeah.
I learned that pretty quickly that when you do philosophy, you can just make stuff up. Not
It's pretty great.
yeah,
Everyone should do philosophy. You're gonna make stuff up. No.
correct. It's like we'll just
Yeah.
add we'll just add a hood to the end of something or a likeness to it, and there we go. You know. Well, I
love
want to
it.
thank you for
That's
taking
awesome.
taking some time and coming on here and having this discussion. And I'm very sure I think we'll have you back on and have some more
Aw.
discussions and some more details. So
Well,
appreciate it.
this was a lot of fun. I just want to say thanks so much for having me, and thanks to all the listeners as well for listening to me ramble on for an hour. But yeah,
No,
this was
you're not
great.
rambling on. You do. It seems to me that you have some books coming out.
Mhm.
Correct?
I
You're what?
do. Well, yeah. So there's the one in applied ethics.
Okay.
So that book is it's basically a maybe you're interested in kind of these applied ethics questions like the ones we cover are abortion, poverty, how much should we give to charity, what kind of like how should we treat the environment, what should we say about those with disabilities? So these kinds of questions, but you're not wanting to dive into, maybe these journal articles that are very technical. This is a much more accessible, kind of friendly book written for someone who doesn't really have a lot of philosophy background but is interested in these kind of applied questions. And I think you did link that in the description. So
Yes.
go check that out if that's kind of the thing you're interested in. A lot of the big kind of debates that have been coming up today, actually, we cover the main arguments for and against. And I'll say too, the point of the book isn't to convince you of one view on these things. We're not like, here's all the reasons you should vote pro-life or vote
Mm.
pro-choice or anything. We're really just trying to lay out, here's the arguments that philosophers have given, so you can kind of be informed about the way philosophers have thought about this. So that's that book. And then the next book, it probably won't be out for a year or two, but it's actually, that one's very related to a lot of things we've been talking about today. And that book is a debate about rational belief and then evidentialism, sort of the role that evidence plays in rational belief. And so I'm excited for that one too. Again, it's we still got to do some work on it, but I'm actually debating another philosopher in the book, and I think it'll be a lot of fun once that comes
Very
out.
good. Yeah. So that's a written debate, folks.
A
And
written debate,
it's
yes.
fun to read written debates because you can go back and look at it,
Yeah.
and so that's enjoyable. You can, I guess, in written debates, the format is you can think quite a bit about what they're saying before you respond. So I find them to be
They
a
can
lot more
Yeah.
beneficial.
They can be higher quality, I think, for that reason.
I
So
agree.
totally.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is 2:03, at least here on the west coast of the United States. I want to thank you guys for joining us and going through this. If you're watching the replay, you've gotten to this point, thank you very much. Go ahead and hit that like button. If you're not subscribed, subscribe, because we try to bring interviews like this once a week, every Thursday at 1 p.m. And also Mondays and Fridays, we have a Q&A time that I just answer people's questions about anything that's related to stuff that I think I know. So tomorrow we'll be on again at 12. So join us for that. Thank you again for being here with us. Take care. God bless you, and we will see you tomorrow.